Very good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Nikhil Vaswani, and I'm a junior consultant at Turner & Townsend. And today we're very kindly joined by Francis Young, Associate Director at KSquared. This is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, and is delivered by Turner & Townsend. This will be a presentation followed by plenty of chances to engage in a Q&A and discussion with Francis. The event will be an hour long and we will finish on time. May I please request that your cameras be switched off and microphones muted during the presentation. The slide deck shared on screen will be made available after the event to all attendees today via a follow-up email. Similarly, there'll be a clean recording of this and all other masterclasses in the resources section of the RISE website. I will shortly provide a series of useful links in the chat function. May I also request that any questions be posted in the chat function as we go along, or alternatively, should you prefer, you may come on screen after the session to ask Francis questions directly. Finally, there will be a quick poll and word cloud at the end of the session. May I please request that you complete these as it helps us understand the level of knowledge across our topics. And with that, I would like to thank everyone once again for joining, and I will hand over to Francis for today's presentation on retrofitting flats and cross-funding. Thank you, and over to you, Francis.
Cool, perfect. Thank you, Nikhil, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have a bit of a split session today. So I'll do an introduction on retrofitting flats specifically, and then move on to cross-funding as well. And as Nikhil said, plenty of time at the end there for open workshop, open floor discussion on that. So let's get started. So a little bit on who we are as well to get us started. We are chartered architects by trade. We run retrofit programs. So we find the funding, we procure design teams, and we find the delivery partners to deliver those projects as well. We are retrofit coordinators, and we're also a social enterprise. So whilst we run like a limited company like anyone else, we find as a social enterprise, we're more aligned to the organizations that we work with. We have certain interests and values in really looking at the social impact that we can deliver through our retrofit work. At the moment, we are working just in social housing. So I'm working with about 13 different housing associations, mostly here in London. About 600 homes in the pipeline at the moment. So whether that's the funding, the design, or the delivery side of things. And we work to PAS 2035, as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of, the retrofit standards that we work to. Also recently completed the BS 7913 qualification. So that's specifically in the protection of traditional and older buildings as well. And then again, as a reminder there, the ARB is our chartered architect compliance side of things. So the first part of the session just on retrofitting flats, just to do a bit of scene setting. So it's actually we looked at it, and it's actually 75% of the properties that we work with are flats rather than houses. And they are all properties, mostly in London, EPC rating of D or below. And as you can imagine, they come in all shapes and sizes, blocks of flats, conversions, Victorian period properties. As an opener from me, I'd say from our experience, there are 3 points that I'd say about flats specifically. One is to first look at who's responsible for it. Who's responsible for what within the freehold title, and how this will influence the retrofit measures that you propose. We're all aware of items such as Section 20 that will influence your property management strategy. And I think that is important because whilst we can carry out the PAS 2035 assessment to establish what is best from an environmental and from a performance point of view, ultimately who is responsible is really important to understand at that early stage as well. The second one is that looking at who pays for what and making it clear that whoever benefits from these fabric first measures may, essentially, if you're looking at loft insulation or if you're looking at cavity wall insulation, it's being aware of who's going to benefit from those retrofit measures and who will be responsible for paying for them. And then also thirdly, looking at how you can benefit from shared preliminaries and mobilization on site. So again, if we're looking at blocks of flats, we have different parts of the building available to us, and again, different levels of responsibility within that. So someone may be responsible for the roof, for the ground, they may have access to certain areas of the building that other tenants within the building will benefit from. So solar panels on the roof may be able to serve the flat in the middle. And I think it's important to really map that out and make that clear to all the people involved in the project early on. And again, who has responsibility for that? I think lastly, as I said, we work just in social housing, but it's important to remember that freehold responsibility can be across tenures as well. So it can be private sector, it can be social housing as well. And it kind of keys in nicely to the next point, and it's that from our experience, we think that small social housing providers, such as housing associations, are really leading the way in bringing people together in how they can deliver locally led retrofit well, in often a consortium model as well. This is a poll that we put out to our clients and to our peer network that basically asked, which housing tenure do you think has the highest EPC rating? The perception was, as you can see there, owner-occupied has the highest rating, followed by social rent and private rent. But the reality is actually quite different. Social rented housing actually has the highest average EPC rating at 70, followed by private rent and followed by owner-occupied. There are obviously many ways to interpret that statistic, but from our experience, in order to mobilize locally led retrofit, we think that social housing providers are really leading the way. And if you have a building or you have a block of flats that has mixed tenure, you can really rely on that ability to deliver retrofit or really learn from those experiences, because they're aligning their capital works, they're aligning their funding ability, sorry. And we think that housing associations are really learning how to deliver improvement works collectively through those consortiums. I think there are already examples there in the private sector in the form of resident associations. I think there are some local neighbourhood groups that I know of near me, so Retrofit Kentish Town, Muswell Hill Sustainability Group, that are coming together across those tenures and doing knowledge sharing pieces on all those easy win measures that you can already do in your home without having to spend too much, but also how you can engage across tenures and across people who are responsible for, have different levels of responsibility, let's say, for properties around them. I think what we looked at as well was when we say about upgrading with retrofit measures in our flats, we're quite interested to find out what are we actually installing, what are the most popular measures or the most effective measures. We do take a resident first approach, because the properties that we work with are not void properties, and often the occupancy profile means that residents are in their homes more than with other tenures. And I think, again, that really affects the measures that we're able to propose to flats in particular. You can see there that ventilation, IWI, low energy lighting, loft insulation really lead the way, followed by heating controls, cavity wall insulation, flat roof insulation, window and door upgrades, and then down there, solar PV, EWI, and underfloor insulation. I was genuinely surprised by this. I think that in terms of the weighting of how much design work is involved, and how much involvement we have in the delivery of some measures, I wouldn't have thought this was the sort of percentages that come out of that. And then, just as a reminder there, that we, through the PAS 2035 process, we arrive at these measures as part of our medium-term implementation plan. So the measures that you can see listed there are part of phase 1, and they get our homes from EPC D and below up to an EPCC. That medium-term implementation plan then captures the rest of the measures that's required in phase 2 or 3 or 4 that follow on from there. And that's really important, because we really want to understand that sequencing of measures that will have the most impact. The next one, this is a sort of last part for this first section on flats specifically, but again, we asked our clients and our peer network about the biggest challenge to retrofit upgrading. Nice straightforward question based on their experience. And evidently we have a lot of time, is the perception. We have ability, certain amount, but we just don't have the money, is the feeling. I'd be very interested after this as well to see if anyone has anything to add on this. The key one, or the secondary question within this poll, was about barriers to entry. How can I get going with my retrofit? And it was very much just around funding, and that it was felt that funding specifically for flats was too skewed towards supply-led measures or to household incomes rather than the actual property performance itself. And we also asked about what do you think is the key barrier to exit? So maybe you have a willingness and an ability to engage with a retrofit program, but are you nervous about being trapped in a program? Let's say if you want to sell the flat or you need movement in some sort of way. And it was generally felt that works are a little bit too onerous, that when anyone talks about retrofit, it's felt like it's an irreversible installation or that it's quite high risk once you go through that installation process. I think specifically on the money side of things, it's why we wanted to pair retrofitting flats with cross-funding. So I will lead on to this next section now. So cross-funding for us is how we can build up the financial capacity of our client base, of the organizations that we work with. Those of us on the call who are familiar with programs like the Warm Homes Social Housing Fund will be well versed in the requirement for co-funding. And essentially, when we say cross-funding, that is a big part of it as well. So that, as we know, in order to access grant funding, there is a co-funding requirement. What we typically do first is we engage with our social landlords to help them access proper funding streams in order for them to implement decarbonisation strategies, which is to say that this first exercise is to map basically where you are required to provide co-funding alongside your grant funding, and then also evidence the client's approach to debt and to asset management alongside that. I think that the cross-funding is a super important part of delivering retrofit, because again, if you're not able to engage with the eligibility criteria and then evidence how you can meet it, it's the fundamental of getting the project brief going in the first place, alongside the technical concerns and then understanding the residents that we're going to work with as well. I think the next point was around understanding how much the cross-funding and the grant funding is a go, don't go of the project, around viability and the eligibility criteria. Essentially, what we do as well is we look at the eligibility of the properties, of the householders as well, and we look at a funding feasibility report that will basically compare the eligibility criteria, the stock that you have in front of you, and the households as well that will benefit from them with the different funding streams that are available. The diagram in front of us is specifically for those public available grants, but obviously there is a whole private finance piece to this as well. What we think is important here about cross-funding is that we want to enable the decision-making again around a go, don't go on your retrofit project, and understand if funding is a determining factor in the viability of the project or not. If I go to the next slide. So just to have a look at the types of cross-funding that are available. And again, it's very important to understand this because it will affect, again, the kind of evidence or the kind of work that we would do as project managers in the project. Actual is having a looking at if the funds are readily available. Are we looking to align our retrofit projects to capital spend that's already been allocated for the future financial years? Is it forecast? So are these feasibility reports and evidencing being used to establish viability? Is it secured cross-funding that we're looking at? So is it secured against assets or capitals that are already there? What are the caveats involved in that? If it's unsecured cross-funding, then there may be less collateral or security behind it, but there may be other stipulations on repayments, such as a time frame. If we're looking at restricted funds in the cross-funding type of funding, I mean, with restricted funds, it's more similar to the grant provision fund, sorry, because as we're all aware, the grant monies don't contribute to your organization's valuation. They don't contribute to your interest cover because it is a restricted fund. And then with the unrestricted fund, we want to be aware when we're applying for unrestricted cross-funding that we offer assurance and not insurance as our role as project managers and architects and retrofit coordinators. Again, it's something you have to be very much aware of that. The last point for me for now, then I'll open up to the floor, so I'm pretty sure we've covered quite a lot of ground, is understanding when you access your cross-funding and key stage valuations within the project. So if we're looking at feasibility stage, then is the cross-funding made available to you based on the eligibility of the properties or the households or the organization itself? Key questions to ask. Is it based on interim valuations? What evidence is required of installation and the methods employed, such as best practice, PAS 2035? Are you working with a measured works contract, such as the JCT? Is the cross-funding supplied based on a relationship? So is it a new or established relationship with a finance provider? Is it based on spend, so cash flow? Is the cross-funding made available after each measure is installed or after the whole property is completed? Is the cross-funding made available upon purchase order? Will this suffice as evidence, or are invoices later required, or are they required at the point of release of funds? And finally, is the cross-funding made available at evaluation? So are we looking at something such as carbon credits that we know are readily available, not readily available, but available through HACT at the moment, the Housing Association Charitable Trust? And is that cross-funding made available when you've unlocked improvements against baseline performance? That's it for me. I'm very happy to hand back over to Nick Hale. And again, very keen to open this up to the floor for a wider discussion. But thank you very much for that.